Morning, everybody. I'll get started while people filter in because I've got a few speaking bits to go through. So, good morning. Delighted to welcome you all to the third seminar in our series on the peatland water environment, which we've co-organised along with the Environment Agency. Today, we're going to be looking at the role of nature-based solutions and innovation in peatlands and how they can deliver water environment benefits. As always, we've got a great lineup of speakers here from across the UK with a diverse range of interests, and I'd like to extend them all our thanks for presenting. We are unfortunately a speaker down today, so we'll be running a slightly shorter programme with three speakers, who I will pop up on the screen there so you can see the running order, and followed by our usual Q&A. We have also had a bit of a technical issue with Zoom, which we hope has been resolved. However, there may be some unexpected interruptions, which we'll try and resolve if they occur. We do seem to be running okay, but we apologise in advance if anything happens. Just the usual bit of housekeeping before I hand over to my colleague Iain Detrey from the Environment Agency. I've just put the outline up. So you can see we'll have our first two speakers, we'll have a quick comfort break, and then we'll reconvene promptly for our final speaker, and we'll follow with the Q&A. Our speakers will be recorded, and the Q&A, as usual, will be unrecorded. We have a large audience today, as ever, therefore we've disabled the chat function. We ask that you put the questions in the Q&A box, and please put the name of the speaker to whom it's addressed for us to direct the questions more efficiently. The Q&A box is also visible to all. So if you'd like to see particular questions answered, then please do upvote them. So keep your eye on the Q&A box there. And if you've got any questions for the IUCN or the Environment Agency, I've just put our contact emails up there, so you can email them directly to us. So I'll hand over to Iain now. Iain, if you're there.
Thanks, Jess. Good morning. I just want to thank everyone again for coming. So my name is Iain Detrey and I'm a peatland advisor in the Environment Agency's National Peatland team. Over the last few months, we have been working with the IUCN UK Peatland Programme to deliver this series of webinars, focusing on the importance of water and the water environment, both within and arising from peatlands. We are a regulatory, advisory and delivery body with statutory duties relating to a healthy water environment in England. And we are committed to the use of nature-based solutions in the face of climate and biodiversity crises. Nature-based solutions from the restoration and sustainable management of peatlands provide a myriad of benefits, from enhanced water quality and water regulation, including flood mitigation, through to improved biodiversity, wildfire resilience, carbon storage, and heritage protection, to name a few. For example, our colleagues within the agency recently published an update to our Working with Natural Processes review, which is available on .gov.uk, which highlights some of the most recent evidence around peatlands' role in natural flood management within headwater catchments. We also directly fund peatland restoration through our Flood and Coastal Risk Management Funding, or FCRM funding, and Water Environment Investment Fund funding, or WEIF funding, to protect communities and deliver improved water quality. And by working closely with water companies through the price review process, we encourage the use of peatland restoration as a nature-based solution to drinking water issues and to deliver biodiversity enhancement. We are also working to expand the evidence base for the use of peatland restoration and sustainable management as a nature-based solution. For example, through our Innovation and Novel Thinking funding, we have worked with the Yorkshire Peat Partnership on monitoring peatland flows, with Newcastle University and the Tyne Rivers Trust on improvements relating to freshwater pearl mussel habitat, and with Exeter University relating to UAV drones habitat surveys, relating those to ecohydrological condition and functioning. And through our Lowland Agricultural Peat Research and Development funding and water discovery pilots, we have explored how the use of nature-based solutions can be utilised to mitigate potential negative outcomes of raising water tables or enhance the opportunities offered by a change in management. And with that quick roundup, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Alice Milne. Alice is from Royal Holloway, University of London, and she will be speaking to us about wet woodlands.
Thanks, Iain. I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yep, we can see those out.
Great, thanks, Jess. So thank you very much for inviting me today. So I'm Alice Milne. I am a senior lecturer, associate professor at Royal Holloway, University of London, and a peat scientist, mostly interested in how peatlands form and function, and particularly wet woodlands, which you're going to find out about in a minute. And I'm the co-lead and the co-founder of the Wet Woodland Research Network. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. But just to say that although I'm giving this talk today, it's really the efforts of many of our collaborators across the Wet Woodland Research Network and co-authors of a paper that we published last year, which was on the same topic as this talk, and quite a few of these network members are here today. So if we take these kind of ecosystems that you can see on this slide, and we find that they're peat forming, and we stick a peat core in them, we will often high chances of finding that that peat core comes out filled of wood fragments, and of wood peat basically. Sometimes it's called brushwood peat, and so it looks a bit like this. And the amount of time that these peat cores and this peat accumulation takes to accumulate, it tells us that these wooded peatland ecosystems aren't transitory ecosystems, but rather that trees and peat have persisted with trees as a major component of the peatland for a long time. And so these are what I think of as our naturally wooded peatland ecosystems. And I'll explain in a moment that many of these have now been lost. They're not here any longer, but the evidence of them remains in the ground in peatland records, and it tells us that trees and peat in some contexts can and have coexisted quite happily and productively for a long period of time. So what I want to talk about today is wet woodlands, what they are, where we find them, why they're important, some information, some basic information about how they function, and what's happening in terms of the research to understand more about how they form and function and their role, and in that the role that they could play in our landscapes. And I'm going to be focusing particularly on peat forming wet woodlands. And there's not going to be much data in this talk, just as a caveat, and that's mainly because these are really quite critically understudied ecosystems, and we're at the start of the journey in the work and understanding how they function. And I'll explain in a moment, as I go through the talk, that we're building a network of people who have knowledge or expertise of these ecosystems, or anyone who's interested in knowing more about these ecosystems, and we'd really welcome anyone who wants to get involved. So before we get into some of the detail about how these ecosystems function, I just want to start on terminology, because I, for one, find this often quite confusing about what actually is a wet woodland. So we use wet woodland as a umbrella term for all wooded ecosystems that are seasonally or permanently flooded, where water and trees are an integral and really integrated part of the ecosystem. And some are almost continuously waterlogged, and these are often called things like, you get names like carr, forested wetlands, forested peatlands, swamp, bog forest, bog woodland, and these are the ones that can form peat. And then you have ones that are more intermittently flooded, and these are sometimes will be called riparian, alluvial floodplain forest. They'll often have mineral or organic rich soil intermingled with alluvial sediments, for example, if they're next to a floodplain. And I'm going to be focusing on the wet woodlands in the UK context, but they're found globally across the temperate regions. And when we think about the peat forming wet woodlands in the UK, they're either these sparse open stands of pine, birch, or ombotrophic peatlands, what we'd call our bog woodlands, or they can be these closed canopy, these low stature stands of alder, willow, birch on monotrophic peatlands, and they're often known as shrub or thicket swamps in North America. But basically, no matter what we call them, their wet woodlands are all associated with wetness and have trees as a natural part of their ecology. And just to be really clear here, we're not including plantations on drained peatlands as wet woodlands. They do have some potential to include a treed element during restoration to a functioning peatland, but they are not wet woodlands as they are. So the natural range of wet woodlands in the UK covers pretty much the entire country, and they can establish where the hydrological conditions are suitable, so where it's wet but not too wet for trees to grow. They're often found along river valleys, lake edges, undrained floodplains, undrained peatlands, or small kind of depressions in the landscapes. And they can be, because of their kind of landscape setting, they can be found in these isolated patches in sort of small wet depressions, or they can be parts of mosaics of larger habitat types, so like with open fen, open peatland, or wet woodland within a drier woodland. Or they can also form these large swathes of covering many hundreds of hectares as well. And although we are rightly nervous about trees and peat because of our history of degrading peatlands from afforestation, but trees can be an important component of peatlands, and they have been naturally in the UK, and there's many examples found globally that do have relevance to the UK. And this schematic is work from Scott Davidson, one of our Wet Woodland Research Network co-founders, and did with some colleagues on the Western Boreal Plain in Canada. And it just shows that for one fen swamp or one fen woodland complex, there's these 5 different land cover types from the peatland centre to the surrounding uplands. And trees can be particularly important on the peatland margins and transition zones between peatlands and uplands. But in the UK, we've lost most of these transitory ecosystems, including our lag fens, and these more transition ecosystems between peatlands and non-peatlands would have often included some kind of woodland component, as well as having a scattering of trees on the main peatland area itself. I mentioned that we've lost a lot of these components from our peatlands, but there is evidence of them in the peat cores. And I was a paleoecologist by training, and so I always like, no matter whenever I'm on a peatland, I like to shove a corer into it to see what's in there. And it gives us insights about where wet woodlands or wooded components of peatlands would have been found. And I just wanted to give you a couple of quick examples of this kind of past evidence so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is a stratigraphic section of what's beneath the ground in a floodplain fen in Norfolk. And it was generated by taking multiple cores, so from the river on the right-hand side along to the boundary with the upland, the peatland boundary, and the upland on the left-hand side. And this was work that was done by Joyce Lambert and colleagues right back in the 1960s, when they were trying to understand the origin of the Norfolk Broads. But the interesting thing for us to note at this point for this talk is that there's these, if you can see it, these little tiny the V pattern with the small V shapes is all brushwood peat. And that's like several meters thick in places. And what we see is almost all of the fens in this region have valley infill of brushwood peat, and that represents this long phase of wet woodland development that continued until there's, for various reasons, there's changes in sea level rise, there was land use changes, and much of those areas of woodland have now been cleared. And just as another example as well from a different land use setting, this time of an ombotrophic peatland, sometimes you find in peat cores that you have these wood peat on the margins with the surrounding upland landscapes. You've got the peatland itself, and then you have on the margins, you have wood peat with that margin with the upland. And sometimes you can also find wood peat in that transition of from going from a fen to ombotrophic bog in certain places. So from being really quite widespread and abundant, when the ice retreated after the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, there's lots of evidence that you'd have these wet wooded landscapes that colonized widespread across most of our floodplains and wet areas in the landscape. And then deforestation began in about the Neolithic period. And wet woodlands were almost completely destroyed and deforested from our floodplains in particular by the Roman period. And then there was later major losses in the 19th and 20th century. And you get a similar pattern of wetland deforestation across continental Europe. And so today, the current estimates of all wet woodland types, so not just those on peat, but just all wet woodlands, is around 78,000 hectares in England, as estimated from Natural England, and potentially around 170,000 hectares across Great Britain. But these numbers are a little bit sketchy because we don't really have the detail and the accurate data on wet woodland extent, particularly linked to peat. But this Natural England map here, I think, shows where wet woodlands have been recorded in a 10 kilometres grid square across England. And it kind of nicely highlights how they can grow in almost all places across the country if the hydrological conditions are suitable. But what doesn't necessarily can be seen in this kind of distribution map is that most of these are really highly fragmented, and there's most are in patches. I think there was 2/3 in patches less than 20 hectares and 1/3 in patches that are less than 5 hectares. So really fragmented ecosystems. But the main point I'm making here is that the current rarity and fragmentation of wet woodlands and the small patch size is mainly because of drainage, clearance and land conversion over centuries, rather than just a lack of suitable climate or natural habitat. And wet woodlands are in a little bit of a tricky position policy-wise. They fall through the gaps a bit because they're not typically included in forestry guidance because they're wet, and they're not suitable really for traditional timber harvesting, and they're not really included in peatland guidance, and that's mainly because there's very little research on them, particularly peat forming wet woodlands. But the structure and the function and the form and the location of these ecosystems means that they've got characteristics that can provide nature-based solutions and co-benefits in multiple ways. And this infographic is what I want to talk about over just the next few slides, to think about how they could contribute as nature-based solutions, just for a few examples. So we're going to start with carbon, because it's a peat webinar. They need to start with carbon really. So wet woodlands can and do form peat, given that they have, if they've got excuse me, if they have suitable waterlogged conditions, they can form peat. Sometimes they can form quite substantial accumulations of peat, like I showed earlier, several meters of peat below ground. And the wood provides quite an important carbon input to that below ground store. And so in these ecosystems, you have the below ground carbon store from the peat, and then you also have this living biomass and carbon stored in the living biomass and the dead wood. And this living biomass provides an additional above ground carbon store. So you've almost got this win-win for above ground carbon and below ground carbon. But unfortunately, there's not that much data yet on the carbon dynamics and balances of these peat forming wet woodlands. And we can't really think just about the carbon stores. We know that healthily functioning peatlands emit methane and other greenhouse gases, and that's certainly no different for wet woodlands. Again, there's very little data on this, with only some preliminary data coming out of the network now, and there's some previous work on greenhouse gas emissions from tree stems in waterlogged conditions. But it's likely that the greenhouse gas fluxes in wet woodlands is controlled by temperature, water table depth, and strongly spatially variable, like with other peatland types. Then in terms of biodiversity provision, in terms of another nature-based solution through biodiversity, wet woodlands can be really quite biodiverse compared to other woodland types. And I don't have time to go into all the different species and the characteristics of the different types of wet woodlands, but I thought I couldn't really give a talk about wet woodlands without mentioning some of these. Two of the species that most people frequently ask us about is the willow tit and the beaver. So the willet-tit, I'm sure you know, suffered massive declines over the last few decades, mainly through habitat loss and fragmentation. And it likes to make its own nests from the standing deadwood or the dead snags. And wet woodland is a really important habitat for it because it has a large amount of deadwood. But the fragmentation is a major issue. And then the other species that people often talk about in relation to wet woodlands is beavers, which are gradually being reintroduced, and they need woodland cover, and really important in creating and restoring wetland habitats, but particularly in creating habitat heterogeneity, like this opening up the gaps in a canopy of the woodland, creating this mosaic of wetland habitat, and you get different age trees, stands, and so on. And this photo on the right gives you an idea of some of the structural complexity and microhabitats that can form in peat-forming wet woodlands. You have these, like, the really saturated ground conditions, often on the soft peat, and so the trees are often really shallowly rooted, and so they fall down all the time, and they're growing at odd angles, and when they fall down, they're opening up light, gaps in the canopy, and get these variable light conditions and tree age structures, and which herbivores would have added to. And you have this quite complex ground microtopography, which hopefully you can see in that photo. You get these kind of root masses and ridges and pools and fallen tree stumps and fallen tree trunks that are growing at certain angles. And all of these experience different flooding or wetness levels. So you get some parts of the wet woodland floor are permanently flooded with permanent pools. Some are wet for most of the time, but not all the time. Some are wet occasionally. Some are wet only during specific flood events and mostly dry. So you have this gradient and really variety and diversity of wetness almost on this micro scale as you move up from the ground level. And then it's a woodland. You have this woodland growing, so you have all the habitat niches that you would have in any type of woodland. And then add to that, you have the deadwood, which is a really important component of wet woodlands. There's a lot of lying deadwood around, and that gradually gets accumulated and into the below ground carbon store. But combined with that and the microtopography and this structural complexity, they can provide really rich habitats. It's probably not surprising for me to say that there's not that much detail and not much that data on the biodiversity of these habitats, but there are a few studies that for invertebrates and some other species as well that have shown really quite rich diversity for certain groups. And what was surprising, and particularly on some of the invertebrate studies that have been done, is that they found many invertebrate species that they didn't expect to find, particularly open fen, open peatland species, and then littoral species and aquatic species that they hadn't anticipated in the depths of the wet woodland. I think what's likely happening is that they are not homogeneous as we might have thought, and the dynamic nature of this ecosystem with these gaps opening, the mosaic, it's like a mosaic of disturbance really. It means that they can hold some of the woodland species, the open species, the wet species, the dry species, and all of that can make them quite exceptionally rich. But just to move on, in the interest of time, another nature-based solution that I wanted to mention as well is particularly around the importance of deadwood is the role that these systems can have in slowing the flow of water. And so deadwood and the structural complexity of wet woodlands can slow the water flow through creating obstructions. So deadwood can form dams. It causes the water to back up into pools. You have these multiple channels where the water is having to find its way through, and that can increase the water storage capacity of wet woodlands and slow the floodwaters. And also, because you have all of this kind of structural complexity on the ground surface and the undergrowth and the deadwood, it can slow the flows further through hydraulic roughness, increasing that hydraulic roughness, and that all increases helps to improve or reduce the downstream flow water. And there's quite a lot of research on alluvial mineral sediment wet woodlands for natural flood management, but there's less on peat wet woodlands, and that's probably because the vast majority of peat wet woodlands and floodplains have long been since cleared, and it represents a major knowledge gap. So with extensive clearance over centuries, it's not really surprising at all that the Natural England have suggested that wet woodlands are in an unfavourable condition. It's similar across pretty much all the UK and most of Europe. And shifting to a favourable status would require around 53,000 hectares increase in patch size just in England to link all the isolated patches, restore the hydrological function and water chemistry, and preferably as well, like encouraging wet woodlands that can accumulate organic matter and peat. And thinking more broadly about land use strategies, there's opportunities for wet woodlands to contribute to various targets. So the 30 by 30, for example, and the tree establishment targets are really like obvious examples that wet woodlands could contribute to and will be contributing to, and possibly on marginal and low grade land that currently needs draining would be suitable for locations for wet woodland re-establishment to make sure that the right trees are in the right places to optimise the benefits that we get from our ecosystems. But at the moment, peat forming wet woodlands aren't in the Woodland Carbon Code because it rightly excludes woodlands on peat more than 50 centimetres, and that's to prevent afforestation of naturally treeless peatlands. And it's really tricky to add in the nuance to have native or natural or wet woodland ecosystems that would naturally be part of our landscapes with wetland adapted trees that don't require drainage. And that nuance, that policy nuance is really tricky to get, particularly with a lack of evidence. And it's a similar story for peatland strategies and the greenhouse gas inventories that don't include peat forming wet woodlands. And that's partly because we really just don't yet understand the extent to which this peatland type could help towards these targets. And there's a real critical lack of underlying data on emissions factors, their form and function, the carbon balance, as well as all the other co-benefits. And so this is where the Wet Woodland Research Network comes in, and it's a network of scientists and stakeholders and organisations, individuals, anyone interested in wet woodlands. And it was founded by a bunch of us academics that were peatland and forest, have got peatland and forest expertise. So me, Andy Baird from peatland hydrologist at Leeds, Emily Lyons, a forest ecologist at Cambridge, and Scott Davison, a peatland scientist at Plymouth and now Montreal. And the aim of the network is to make it easier to collaborate across research and policy and practice organisations to understand how wet woodlands form and function and how they can fit into some of our land use decisions. So just to finish off, just to explain a bit about what we're doing there. So we're working with other members to build a network of wet woodland monitoring sites across the country, and the idea is setting up long-term monitoring plots. We can start to track some of the gains and losses in ecosystem services, compare the form and function and dynamics of different types of wet woodlands. I've only talked about a couple of different types here, but there's lots of different types. And then so we can then start to get a better understanding of how they form and function and their dynamics and different ecosystem and landscape settings. So we have monitoring set up at several sites so far with some of our partners. So there's Wheat Fen, it's a tidal floodplain fen wetland, wet woodland in Norfolk. We've had hydrological monitoring ongoing there for several years, and we're now monitoring the carbon dynamics of the wet woodland. And this is Crystal monitoring root productivity as part of her PhD. And then we have Gosmore and Eden Project in Cornwall, which are monitored by Emma Dooley and Scott Davidson to understand more about the functioning, particularly some of the greenhouse gas fluxes. And this is Emma's set up with greenhouse gas monitoring, and she's getting some really interesting data coming from her sites that she'll be publishing as part of her PhD. And then there's Wakehurst in Sussex, which is the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew Wild Botanic Gardens site. And it's a really lovely patch of wet woodland that isn't peat forming, but it has these organic rich layers, and we're looking to understand the functioning of the site and whether peat, it seems that peat has been accumulating at some points, but then not others, and so to just understand what's happening there. And it's part of their Nature Returns project, another PhD researcher, Steph Batten, and they have continuous greenhouse gas monitoring at the site, thanks to a great team there. And a story for another day, but it's very tricky to have continuous greenhouse gas monitoring kit set up in a site that is constantly flooding. So there's lots of really good work happening there. And then we're just next week we'll be setting up a monitoring plot in collaboration with Natural England at Mosside Farm, part of the Chatmoss Peat Complex. It's this lowland raised bog that they've been used for agriculture, and it's now being re-wetted as part of a larger complex of fields across around about 150 hectares, owned and managed by Natural England. And the aim for this research really is to have long-term monitoring to understand more about the trajectory of scrub encroachment on our degraded peatlands, what happens after re-wetting, and whether ecosystem gains can happen and in what timescales, and whether the habitat sorts itself out if the hydrological conditions are suitable, and what interventions are needed to deal with scrub encroachment on degraded peatlands, and whether it's a problem or not a problem. So there are lots of interesting things happening there as well. And so just to finish up, hopefully that gives you an idea of wet woodlands and what they are and the work that we're doing around them. And the Wet Woodland Research Network is still getting up and running. So if you'd like to join us, or you've got any data or findings that you think would be relevant, particularly some of the things I've mentioned today, or you know of any suitable sites, or you want to set up monitoring sites, please get in touch and we can chat more. And I just wanted to finish with this image, this photo of Emily Lyons, where we're attempting to set out a permanent plot in a wet woodland. And you've got these really treacherous, wet and boggy ground conditions. You've got several meters of soft peat beneath you that if you put your foot wrong, you can go right into it. And there's not many people who seem to venture into the middle of these wet woodlands, so they can often feel like really wilderness landscapes where no one seems to tread. And some of the logistical challenges of working in them, it's frankly not surprising that they've been understudied for so long, but they are really important components of our landscapes that could provide us with multiple benefits if some of their former extent was re-established in suitable locations. And that's the work that we're trying to do, encouraging others to do to help provide the evidence base for. And that's all I wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alice. That was brilliant, really interesting. I'm going to hand over to Laurie Friday now for our next presentation from the University of Cambridge. So whenever you're ready, Laurie, I'll let you share your screen.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, I hope you can hear me and there's not too much echo. That was a great talk. Thank you very much, Alice. And it really makes me feel that I want to get my pond net out again and get out there and immolate myself in a wet woodland. I'm a freshwater biologist by background, and I've spent 25 years in between and the university administration. So I've now finally, in my retirement, escaped back to some freshwater biology. And for the last couple of years, I've been trying to help run a programme called the Centre for Landscape Regeneration, which is a UKRI funded project over 5 years, looking at systems-wide and systems detail analyses of landscapes, one of which is the Fenland of East Anglia. And it's in that context that I want to speak this morning. And our project really covers everything from greenhouse gas emissions through hydrology, through biodiversity, through keeping the Fens farming. Just a little part of a large machine with lots of cogs in it. And my job has been really to bring together some of the biodiversity things to do with ditches. And there's a big question about how you restore biodiversity in the Fens, which I think we can all relate to. And the question that we've asked is, what can our ditches do for us? And what we've done is, Alice showed us lots of lovely ecology, and she said there's no data in it really. I'm unfortunately going to show you lots of data and perhaps less ecology, so this is something completely different. Okay, so are you seeing this in slideshow mode?
Yeah, we are.
I seem to be unable to advance the slides. Okay, so that did it, whatever it was. So Fenland biodiversity loss, as we all know, is huge. It started off as a really large wetland, 4,500 square kilometres in the east of England, and that's been reduced to 45 square kilometres approximately. So that's a 99% loss of area of wetland in East Anglian Fens. And sustained drainage, as we know, over the last 350 years or more, has created something of a nature black hole. And here is a map from the Fens biodiversity audit of 2012, showing where red data book species, which can be taken as a proxy for old wetland species, among other things, where they are in the Fens. And it really boils down to just a few places now, sort of the Great Fen area, Chippenham Fen and Wycombe Fen, and there's virtually nothing else. All the white squares are no red data book species, and the blue squares are just a few. So the question is really, how can you bring back these species into the landscape? How do you get them out of those red circles into the rest of the landscape? And we've been looking at this southern half of this map. So in the southern half of the map, you have the old black peat fen, freshwater black peat laid down when rivers were held back by rising sea levels. To the north of that, you've got silt fens. So I'm very sorry to everybody in Lincolnshire. I'm not going to be talking about the silt fens, but really just about the peat fen area. How can we get the biodiversity back? And could the solution be hiding in plain sight in the ditches, which are almost all that is remaining of the freshwater habitat in much of Fenland? Now, this is not a new question. This is a very old question. And folks have been advocating for restoring ditches in the Fens and using them to restore biodiversity for a long time. There are manuals which tell you how to do it. There are lots of reports out there that report on biodiversity in fen ditches. So what can we bring to it that actually might be different and new? So research questions that we've posed for ourselves is, do the ditch species assemblages that we currently have resemble the flora and fauna of the pre-drainage fen? Do we have any evidence that we can use to actually make that comparison? How is that biodiversity structured across the Fens? And what are the drivers of biodiversity in the fen and ditches? And the approach we've taken is to take a large data set. So 3 surveys carried out by the same 2 researchers, John Graham and Martin Hammond, who are on our team, which is great. Over about a decade, we put in another field season in 2023, and they were looking at the flora and the water beetle fauna. They looked at 365 drainage ditches, and that's 20-metre transects, and so that's about 7.5 kilometres of linear habitat that have been plunged through by the survey team heroically. In the southern peat fens, so that's south, middle and north levels for those who know the area, which includes 18 drainage districts under internal drainage boards. They also included floodplain and tributary ditches of the Great Ouse, the rivers in the name. And this includes nature reserves, but excludes rivers and main drains. So this is a map of where our sites are. Each blue dot is a site running through the middle of that from 7 o'clock to 1 o'clock is the Ouse washes, and across the top from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock is the main washes. And the white area in the middle are various areas of upland, like the Isle of Ely. And that's in order to look at this data set, which is 365 by 300, whatever, it's quite a big data set. And so our first hypothesis is that fen ditches are not all the same, which would be apparent to anybody who's walked through the fen a pair of ways. So this is a farm ditch, and it's in the low-level system. And by the low-level system, I mean the agricultural drainage system. So these ditches are managed by farmers as and when they need to. This is an IDB drain. So the field ditches take the field drainage water and conduct it by gravity into these IDB drains. And then by gravity, that flows down to a pump. And in the far distance of that shot, you can see, or not, a pumping station, which will lift that water up into the river, because the rivers are now perched above the landscape and running over the top of it. And you also have nature reserves on reclaimed farmland in this area. And in the background of this slide, you can see an embankment, and on the top of that embankment is the river. So that's a height differential between the water in the foreground and the water which is in the river of 3 or 4 meters. That's the amount that the landscape has shrunk through peat drainage. So these 3 field types are in the low-level system. But then there's the high-level system, which is attached to the rivers. So you have floodplain ditches actually between the embankments that hold the rivers up above the landscape, and these get inundated quite frequently in winter. In fact, this is one of the main ways in which flood control is exercised for the towns and cities on the edge of the fens. You have these tributaries, which are called catchwater drains, which literally catch the water coming down from the higher land and conduct it by gravity into the river. And you have nature reserve ditches, which are managed as and when, and sometimes get very full of Phragmites, and that's one of our field assistants, Rachel, up to her neck in it. So those 3, the latter 3, are in the high-level system. So that's our first hypothesis. They're not all the same. The second hypothesis is that the species aren't all the same. So we've divided our 306 plant species, of which 23 have some conservation status, which is of interest, into 5 groups: the aquatics, the submerged and floating leaf. And these are species that have a requirement for moisture. So on the Ellenberg moisture scale, they score very highly, 11 and 12. Then you have ammonia species with their feet in water and their heads in the air. Fen species, which are typical of groundwater-fed fen, with some inundation, sometimes in winter. And then dry grassland and rudrels. Our 138 water beetle species, of which 28 are nationally scarce, we divided into those that are mainly the carnivorous Hydradophaga, and the vigorous swimmers that we mostly know as water beetles, and the Polyphaga that are found normally, but not entirely, in water only as adults and mostly herbivorous and detritivores. So this is the way we try to find structure in this big database, by looking at how these different ditch types and species groups actually might pan out. So the first question, how much does it resemble the old fen flora and fauna? And we're lucky that in the 1920s, John Stanley Gardner got a group of his friends together and actually got them out into the field and made them look really hard at Wicken Fen. And they published a group of monographs in the 20s and 30s on the natural history of Wicken Fen. So we have these species lists. So we've compared these species lists with those that we found in the ditches in the last couple of years. The green circles are ditches that are currently out there, and the black circles are the 1923 list from Wicken Fen of the flora. The rudrels and grassland don't figure in that at all, and so we've taken the 2000 species list from Wicken Fen as comparison for the rudrels and grassland. And the answer is that, well, yes, they do. I mean, there's very big overlap in the aquatic species between now and the 1923 list, and the emergence are pretty highly overlapped as well. But the fen species, there's a huge gap. 52 species are missing from the current drainage system compared to what was in Wicken Fen in the 1920s, and indeed pre-war Wicken Fen. We'll come back to the rudrels and grassland later, but what about the beetles? And it's true that there's quite a distinctive pattern here too, is that the carnivorous Hydradophaga are much more like aquatic plants, and the Polyphaga are somewhere nearer to fen species. And if you look at the and the historic data sets for aquatic species and the carnivorous water beetles, and much less so elsewhere. So we have hope that we actually have a repository, if you like, of fen species in some of the ditches. So how is that biodiversity structured? And the answer that immediately strikes you when you go out and look in ditches is that each species has rather few. Each ditch has rather few species. And indeed, each species is in rather few ditches. So plant species, especially, very sparsely distributed, and the variation between the ditches is high. So here we have low alpha diversity, high beta diversity between ditches. And if you put all the ditches together, you get high gamma diversity. But the different plant groups, as you can see on the left-hand side, pan out differently. The aquatics, which are the blue tones, tend to reach their maximum number of species quite quickly, whereas the drier ones, the red tones, go on adding species as you go on. What we've done here is as if you're doing a random walk through the fens and you go to one ditch after another and just try to work out how many new species you see as you add another ditch. And we ask the computer to do this over many iterations. So it is extraordinary that for, say, the grassland species, the pink lines, that even after 350 ditches, you're still finding new species at quite a rate. And this tells us really that if you're going to make comparisons across fen ditches, you're going to have to look at quite a lot of ditches, not just 5. You have to look at probably hundreds. And the same is true for water beetles. And their species accumulation curve is much more like the aquatic plant species than it is like the dry grassland species. So you have to look at ditches at a landscape scale, a large number of ditches. What are the drivers of that biodiversity? Here we're going to take the first hypothesis and divide things up into these different ditch types. So we've used blue tones for the high-level river system and brown tones for the agricultural low-level system. And just looking at those accumulation curves again for aquatic plants, there's really no clear difference between the high-level and the low-level system in how those species are distributed. But if you look at fen plants, then a clear and consistent difference emerges between the high-level system and the low-level system. So the source of this water is different. From the high-level system, the water is coming from outside the fens, it's coming from limestone areas and chalk areas and so on, whereas the agricultural water is almost all rainfall coming out of the agricultural drains. If you look at species richness and ditch type, then you can see this again. The fen species where the high-level system is consistently richer than the low-level system, but hardly any difference within those systems. The aquatics, the mixtures of diversity is a bit more complicated. The emergence, again, show the high-level system to be richer. And with the water beetles, what's happening there? Certainly, if you look at the left hand, the Hydradophaga, those brown and green bars are nature reserves, and they do tend to be higher than the other sites. So that's the number of species. How about the actual species that are there, the assemblages? What's the nature of those? And here we've used canonical correlation analysis, which enables you to look at the species. This is presence, absence of species, and look at that against the potential explanatory variables that you might have. So we have the width of the water, the slope of the bank, the conductivity of the water, various other things are in there. And instead of plotting all the dots, what we've done is put an ellipse around all the sites that fall within each of the 6 site groups. And the green and the brown ellipses are clearly coming out as being quite interestingly different in their species assemblages in many of these plant group types, so especially in aquatic plants. And these are the nature reserves again. So the green ones are the high-level one and the brown ones are the low-level one. And if you ask what are the explanatory factors that most explain the variation in these assemblages, for the aquatic plants, it's the width of the water and the slope of the bank. And the slope of the bank is important in almost all the other groups. For rudels, they don't seem to care what happens. For the water beetles, it's much the same story. The nature reserves come out as really rather peculiarly different, and slope and conductivity are important. I just want you to just sort of look back maybe at the yellow and orange ellipses, which are quite hard to see, but there's really not much going on there. They sit right on top of each other. So these are the IDB drains and the farm ditches in the lowland system. And I'd like to concentrate on those ditch types a bit more, because that's where the most potential is for actually restoring biodiversity in the fens in the agricultural system. So the explanatory variables from the previous diagram were really to do with width and slope and to do with ditch type. How are those related? And again, if you'll just concentrate on the yellow and the orange, I think, the width of the water is very much less so in the field ditches than any other ditch type. And that's kind of what you expect, because they're really at the top end of the drainage system. Each of those cells of drainage, which are the drainage districts, these are the ones at the top end, and they flow into the IDB drains, which are going to be wider. If you then look at the bank slope, they both have pretty steep banks. So this is a 60-degree slope, which is a very steep and very difficult to sample slope. And this is steeper than in most other types of ditch. Because this is a drainage system, you have to keep digging them out in order to maintain the drainage. And if you do that, then you also affect the stage of succession that you find in the vegetation in the ditches. And because farmers will clear out their field ditches as and when they need to, then they tend to hold a lot more of the later stages of succession. That's the top of the bars in the bottom right-hand diagram, than in the IDB drains, where they clear them out on an annual or biennial cycle. So there's quite a lot of variation between ditch types in these basic factors, and these do actually affect the flora and fauna. So just looking at the aquatic flora for a moment, how does width affect the number of species? And the yellow line there, which is slightly hard to see, sorry, that's the farm ditches. That has pretty much the steepest slope, and really what you're looking at there is a 1 metre increase in water width, giving you about 2 new aquatic submerged species. And the orange line, the IDB drains, it gives you about 1 new species per metre of ditch. And we also know that this may increase the number of macroinvertebrate species you get. More plant species, more macroinvertebrate species. This is a data set gathered by John Graham and Chris Kirby-Lambert for Fen and Soil. So that looks like a good thing to do, widen your ditches. But if you widen your ditches, can the species actually get there? And for aquatic species, these are very, very highly dispersive species. So they are adapted, many of them, very much for moving around from one water body to another through hydrocorous seeds or through fragments of vegetation. And we looked at 6 of the drainage districts that are around the Great Ouse and the Little Ouse, and that are all next to each other. And they're not joined to each other in any way except through the pumps with which they communicate with the river, so pumping up into the river, or inlets for farm irrigation during the summer. And the connectivity in the system is very, very high for aquatic plant species, as you can see from these similarity coefficients. And Wicken Fen is in there, and we also compared to Wicken. So the river system really is very, very similar in its aquatic species to each of those 6 drainage districts, and they're all similar to each other. So dispersal seems to be no problem really for aquatic species. And this is true also for most water beetles. But if you look at the fen plants, then this picture is very different. The similarities are very low. The river system is about 50% related to the internal drainage boards. And here, it may not be a dispersal problem, though. It may be more to do with habitat availability, because there are some species missing from the fen list in the ditches, which are very highly dispersive, things with tiny seeds like orchids that could get around, but they're not showing up on the banks of the ditches, so why not? And I think this is largely to do with the nature of a fen ditch, because on the top left-hand corner, you've got what an unmodified ditch may look like. And this is one with a 45-degree angle slope. So this is a moderate slope for a fen ditch. And fen ditches are as full of air as they are of water for most of the year. So the solid line is the water line, and the dotted line shows what would happen if it was bank full. And on the top right hand, you've got a bit of a colour code for the different plant species groups. So submerged ones are pale blue, emergent species are dark blue, and the green is the fen species, and rest is the rudrels and dry grassland. But there's a very, very strong and compressed ecological gradient at that bank, where there's virtually nowhere for an emergent species or a fen species to actually settle down and grow. So what can you do about that? Here we've got the same one-to-one pattern, but just move back a bit with a berm at the water surface, which would increase the emergent vegetation zone. And that would increase the bank width as well at the top by about half a metre. If you're going to increase the fen species, then you're going to need to relax the bit above that as well, which could possibly get inundated at different times of the year. So you increase that zone. That not only increases the emergent zone, but it also increases the capacity of the ditch. It's increased the volume, if you like, cross-sectional area, which is important for a drainage ditch. And it also puts more light into the aquatic zone, and that will encourage the aquatic plants. And that will take about 1.5 metres worth of land at minimum. You can reprofile a ditch on one side, and that's very valuable, because if farmers on either side of a ditch don't agree to do this sort of work, then it doesn't matter. One farmer can do it and the other one cannot do it, and everybody will still be happy. So what would be the impact if that was done? We know that the clearance cycles and the drainage function of these ditches varies a lot, and this influences the biodiversity. So it would be important to maintain lots of different ditch types across the landscape to maintain this high gamma diversity of the ditches all being different. But there are thousands of kilometres of ditches in Fens. About 28,000 kilometres, I think, was the estimate 50 years ago. That would have come down a bit, but it's still a lot. And just on the back of an envelope, you can work out that the existing ditch habitat is at least 2.5 times the area of what we've got left of the old fen nature reserves. So there's a lot of potential here. And not only that, it's very pervasive in the landscape. It's not just stuck in one spot. It just infiltrates the whole landscape with about 100 metres of ditch per hectare. So for 1 hectare's worth of land, you could have a square hectare of re-wetted field, or 5 kilometres of ditch widened by 2 metres. Or you could have both, why not? So ditches may offer an effective linear supplement to area-based restoration programmes. So why don't we get on with it? So increasing water width and relaxing bank slope seems to be a good thing for almost all of these groups of species. Green lines mean good for, red ones mean not so good for. But what about other benefits and unintended consequences, maybe? So what about water conveyance and storage? We know the water width will increase that, and so will relaxing bank slope. Having more aquatic weeds will reduce conveyance and storage, so that might be a problem. Emergents certainly do, because they increase the roughness enormously for drainage. What about methane emissions? Water width, more water in the landscape, more methane. We also know that. But we know too, from some lovely work in the Netherlands, that aquatic plants that are rooted and submerged actually mitigate methane emissions. However, we know that emergent plants actually conduct methane into the atmosphere. We also know that too many emergent species actually shade out the aquatic species. So that all means that we just have to do weed management, more or less. What about biodiversity? So dragonflies and reed warblers definitely benefit from aquatic plants. They benefit from emergence. Pollinators do well from all of these groups of plants, and they also harbour crop pest predators, brown beetles and so on, which gives agricultural services to farmers. Water voles well, doing things to the bank slope may well do good things for bank voles, but we also know it's quite difficult to do things for bank voles without doing things to bank voles. Water voles, sorry. Doing things to banks will also affect water bulbs, even if you mean to do good things for water bulbs. So that is a bit of a problem. Mosquitoes, more water in the landscape, possibly more mosquitoes, but we also know that having wider ditches increases your carnivorous water beetles, and carnivorous water beetles are a very strong control on mosquitoes. Water quality benefits from all of these things, in that you can have buffer strips that actually filter water coming off farmland into ditches. So what do we need to do? We need to view it as a whole system and think about the unintended consequences. And I just can't tell you too strongly that all we've done is look for patterns in a data set. We haven't done any experiments. Other people have done some experiments, but we need far more data. What actually happens to the fen biodiversity if you widen a ditch or relapse the bank? We need before and after studies. Paired sites where you do a widened ditch and a not widened ditch are all very well, but you need a lot of those to actually see the patterns. So real experiments before and after would be good. What happens to the drainage function? So more hydrological modelling and field measurements, which some of my colleagues are busy at the moment. What happens to methane emissions? There's a lot of work going on here. Legislation. IDBs, the drainage boards, need to be empowered to actually sort of do more than just drain the fens. And as many of them are very keen to do this and are actually doing terrific work in biodiversity already. We also need to resolve the water bulb question to make it more possible to do work on ditches. And incentives. Farmers and drainage boards need to be supported in managing ditches and drains in a variety of ways to deliver these multiple benefits as if they're wet hedges. And farmers tell us again and again that they are very keen to do this sort of stuff, but they need to feel that they're not losing money in doing it and that it's actually good for their business. So, restoring fen biodiversity, ditches could offer part of the answer to that question, I think. And I'd just like to thank all the members of the team who worked very hard on this to make it possible to gather this data set and also to help analyse it. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Laurie. That was brilliant. We'll take a quick 5-minute break. So if we could come back, we're at 11:03 at the moment. So if we come back at 11:08, we'll reconvene for our final speaker, who is Roxane Andersen. So I'll let you all grab a quick cup of tea and see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Roxane, are you there ready to present?
Yes, I am. I'm just going to share my screen.
Excellent. I'll hand over to you then.
Yeah, hopefully you can see this. So
yeah, I can see that.
Perfect. So thank you very much for allowing me to present today and for inviting me for this session. I'm actually going to present most of the stuff that's come out of one of my PhD students' work. So Liam Godwin has just completed his PhD and is just about to hand his final corrected thesis. So a lot of the work that I'm presenting is actually not peer-reviewed, published, but will be in the short term. But just wanted to acknowledge that this is really Liam's work and Liam's PhD, or a lot of the talk is based on his work and his PhD. So just to start, I think we often hear the statistics around peatland and carbon. The most of the carbon is the peatlands are the most effective carbon sink in the terrestrial environment, and that they contain huge quantities of carbon. But I think it's also important to remember that peatlands are also really important in terms of the water. In fact, we know that peatlands contain about 10% of the Earth's non-glacial fresh water. So everywhere where there's peatland, there's also water. And in the UK, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody to know that most of the drinking water has its source in a peaty catchment of sorts. And this is a really important consideration when thinking about any intervention that is targeted at water. So it's the water in the rivers and the streams, most of it in the UK is some way or other as the connection to peatland. And this is particularly true in Scotland, of course, where quite a lot of the peat is found. And in Scotland, as you might know, we now have the first and only World Heritage Site in the world that is designated or inscribed for the fact that it's a peatland. So although a lot of our peatlands are degraded across of the UK, we also have some very fine example, in fact the best example in the world of this particular type of landscape, the blanket bogs. So this is the flow country, and this is where I work. And so the research that I'm going to be presenting today might be a bit different in the context of what has just been presented, you know, the ditches and the agricultural conversion, and also some of the work that Alice was talking about, the kind of wet woodland remnants. So this talk really that I'm presenting today focuses on the water research that we've been doing in the flow country, in and around the flow country, where the context is a little bit different, which a lot of emphasis on protection of peatland that are already in good condition, restoration of peatlands, and management of peatlands as well that have been historically degraded. So of course we know that this is an important landscape for peat, but when we overlay on top of the same map the rivers and streams, so the water courses, then it becomes very apparent that this is also a really important landscape for water. In fact, out of the flow country peatlands flow 13 rivers and their tributaries, and so flow east to the North Sea or north to the Atlantic Ocean. And importantly, we have 4 of the 17 rivers, salmon river special area of conservation for Scotland. So as well as important for the carbon and the peat in the peatland themselves, this area is particularly important for the water and the water quality and quantity in the rivers. Some of the rivers also support other endangered species like freshwater pearl mussel and European eels. And when we did the assessment of for the nomination of the flow country as a World Heritage Site, the connection between the peatland and the rivers was a very important one. So the quality of the peatland and the contribution of the peatland catchments to the quality of the rivers that then support these important species for biodiversity was noted and is part of the narrative of the inscription. However, around the world, the Atlantic salmon population have been crashing down in recent decades, and really this is a really important thing for the rivers in Scotland and particularly in the flow country. So whilst in the northern parts of Scotland, in the Highlands, we don't have that many people, so the argument of water quality for drinking water is not particularly as strong as it is in other parts of the UK. The argument of making sure that the water quality is high to maintain the salmon population is a very important one. In fact, the net economic value of wild fisheries in Scotland almost 10 years ago now was estimated to be around 28 million per year. So as many of the colleagues I work with in my role on the board of the Flow Country Rivers Trust say, a bad year for salmon in the Flow Country River is really bad for all the people that depend on this economy and on this economic activity. So understanding what catchments management in terms of nature-based solution, what peatland restoration in particular can do to maintain the population of salmon in the rivers that we have, or potentially impact the salmon population, is one of the things that we were really interested to find out with Liam's PhD. So one of the particular things that I wanted to talk a little bit about today was this idea that whilst restoration is a good thing for the peatland, it is also a very intensive intervention at the landscape level that might have unintended consequences on water quality. And this was one of the questions that the PhD was really seeking to evidence a little bit further. Is there any evidence that peatland restoration at the landscape scale, at the large scale, could be detrimental for the salmon habitat that we're also needing to protect? In the flow country, many of you will know, and as was mentioned in Alice's presentation as well, there have been historical afforestation by non-native conifer over very large areas. And really since the 1990s, this has been tackled through forest-to-bog restoration, so very large-scale removal of forestry that was planted on deep peat as very low economic value as a forestry, and is removed actively as part of our peatland restoration programme in Scotland. This is an example here. So this is the dike forest. There was over 1,000 hectares of forestry, Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine, that was removed in recent years. And the techniques involved are again very intensive. So there's machinery, there's tree felling, tree removal, brash management, and all of these things we know have potential impacts on water quality. And we have worked extensively in the kind of effects of that types of peatland restoration in the peat water, the water that is found just in the peat and in the streams that immediately drain areas around those. And we generally have found that indeed there are some effects on water quality or changes in water quality that can be associated with the operation, if you like, of the removing of the trees and the associated brash management. And we found really three kind of classes of effects, and that was done mostly through Paul Gaffney's PhD and subsequent pieces of work alongside his PhD between 2013 and 2020. And what we found really was that, first of all, there's an immediate effect, and when you remove trees from landscape, the trees intercept some of the cations, like sodium and some of the particularly the elements that are coming from the sea spray. They are intercepted by the forestry, and as soon as you remove the trees, these cations tend to reduce significantly in the peat pore water. As the trees are removed and as the brash is managed on site, so there's the mulching, there's the kind of movement of the brash, if you like, and that can be associated with the decomposition of that material that releases things like dissolved organic carbon, nutrients that were associated with the fertilization. So nitrogen and phosphorus can be released a little bit over time. They tend to tail off after a number of years. And then there's kind of legacy effects of the forestry that we found that persisted even long after the forestry was removed in some of the sites that Paul studied, where there is still not quite a full recovery of the water table, and sometimes the pH tended to take a bit longer to recover. But these were very much effects in the peat on site, so at the top of the catchments, if you like. What about when that water is moved from the peatland into the rivers? So we know that there are a lot of dilution effect that can happen, particularly if the forestry is only part of the catchment, so it's not the whole catchment being the forestry that is being removed, or if there are buffers between the forestry and the streams themselves. And that really was the question that we wanted to answer here, was looking not at the forestry themselves and in the drains or in the forestry, the peat within the forestry, but really looking into the rivers. And for Liam had a very extensive network of sites, but I just wanted to talk to you about one particular area. So the aerial photo that I was showing just before was this plot here, the River Dyke forestry. But you can see within the landscape there are other forestry that are still standing, and then forestry that's been removed. The purple color here means that it's been removed a much longer time ago. So that was removed in 2006 using older techniques, whereas the dike was removed much more recently, so between 2015 and 2020, with some bits still standing. And that's the River Dyke here. That is a known river, Salmon River. There are redds in the dike, and it connects to the River Hallidale. And the River Hallidale is another important salmon river, bigger river. And so what we did in what Liam did really in those two sites was we collected a number of samples. So there were water samples that Liam collected over the course of 2 years on a monthly basis or thereabouts, and also did one spot sampling. So one sampling in July 2022, just to look specifically at invertebrates. And one of the thing that we really wanted that we were mindful of and that we wanted to incorporate into the data analysis was the fact that, of course, the water flows. It flows in one direction only. And so we wanted to make sure that we incorporated potential impact from upstream as you move downstream and as the river connects. So this is why we have sampling points that are before where the restoration is starting, sampling points that collect water after older restoration, sampling point that collects water within actively restored or very recently restored areas, and then sampling points that connected further to the main river. And we used a statistical method that enables us to connect these points spatially and to be explicit about the fact that what happens further up the catchment might be influencing what happens downstream. And by doing that, we were able to identify a bit better whether effects were directly related to what has happened at that particular point, or whether it was influenced by things that might have happened further up into the catchment. And what Liam looked at was basically the full range of water quality parameters that I mentioned above. So the cations, the dissolved organic carbon, the nutrients, the sediments, pH, water temperature, etc. And we looked at it over time to see how these things were changing with the activities. And what we found really, starting with the snapshot, the kind of snapshot of invertebrate. So they were kick samples taken at all these different points upstream, all the way to from the dike to the Hallidale. And what Liam found really, that was, the story of his PhD, is not much difference. So basically, as you move upstream, downstream to the dike, and then connecting to the Hallidale, so this is the bigger river, this is a smaller river, and we're looking at the relative abundance here of different families of invertebrates. So rather than looking at species, in this case, he classified them by their feeding habits, because from a salmon perspective, the species identity doesn't matter very much. Things like body size is more important, and things where the invertebrates are likely to be. So if they're gathering collectors or filtering collectors or predators and scrapers, their position in the water column is a bit more important than what exactly species they are. So from a salmon perspective, actually, there is not much difference between the different positions along the catchment. And in fact, what Liam found was really that the differences were much more attributable to what was at the bottom of that particular stretch of the river that he was sampling. Was it more peaty or was it more rocky? And that made up a much bigger part of the explanation in terms of the differences than what was happening at the catchment. In other words, really what is happening in stream processes are much more important at controlling the invertebrate biomass and abundance than what might be happening further up in the catchment. So there was no significant effect of the water quality changes that could explain the subtle differences in the invertebrate relative abundance. And really what we saw is that if you look at the relative abundance, it all look very similar. But then if you look at the biomass, there's a slightly different story emerging, and that there is a much lower biomass at some of the downstream points. So these 2 points here have a much lower biomass than the further upstream, right? And then it's important to look. So it's the same families of invertebrates, but what we're looking at now is biomass rather than just abundance. And then you can see this is up to 400 milligrams, and here is an order of magnitude lower, so it goes to about 40 milligrams. So basically, as you move into the bigger river, the biomass decreases. And what Liam has kind of interpreted from his data and looking at all the other variables and understanding the context is really that at the location D4 and D5, so these are more peaty bottoms of the river, so it's much peatier, a bit narrower. And as you move closer towards the junction with the Hallidale, the bottom becomes a bit more rocky, wider. There's more opportunities for predation as well because it's a bit more open and exposed. And then it meets the river, and really this is the in-stream processes again. So these 2 points behave much more like a wider, bigger river than the points further up the catchment. So as you move up the catchment, the biomass increases, but it's not necessarily related to the intervention. Of course, much longer term data would be needed to really untangle a little bit what is the catchment effect versus the position in the stream. But this is the first one of the first data sets that we have that allows us to understand a little bit of the importance of the relative importance of what happens in the catchment versus what happens in the river. When we looked at not the invertebrate, but when Liam took his long-term kind of time series of variables, again, the main conclusion that came out of this was that actually there were very few variables that were influenced by the land management. So the water quality didn't seem to be influenced very much by what was happening in the catchment, and that's because there's a lot of dilution in most of these areas. So even within the most of the points, there was so much dilution that we couldn't really pick out much differences, except for phosphorus. So phosphorus was one of these, and this is what we're seeing here. So here, what is presented is the maximum, the mean, and the minimum values, and it is absolutely clear that the phosphorus, as you move into the restoration area, the phosphorus really increases significantly. And this is attributable to the same processes that I mentioned before. So there's the brash is leaching phosphorus that was added as a fertilizer. And if there's a significant proportion of the catchment that is foul, then there's lots of brash kicking about and lots of brash being decomposed that can contribute to inputs of phosphorus in the river. What we see is that as that river then merges with the Halladale, there is also an increase. It was not a statistically significant increase, but it's still notable. And one of the things that we think might be happening is that although the phosphorus doesn't seem to increase as much here, it might simply be bound into algal biomass or into the vegetation that might be on growing into the rivers. So there's a bit more work to understand really how much that could be impacting salmon. So there's no clear link at the moment with the salmon, but this is something that we want to look further. So at the moment, the levels that we've monitored were not deemed to be harmful to salmon, but if there is a bit more to the story, it still needs to be investigated a bit further. The other thing that we noticed, and that was particularly interesting, was that the very last point here, Liam found that there was an increase in sediment that was completely unrelated to what was happening further up in the catchment. So it didn't seem to be coming from the restoration, because then we would have seen increases in the previous sites to that. But what happened is that in this area here, there is an area of degraded peatland, and what we think is that whilst the increase in sediment is notable only at this point, we think it's not because it's draining this part. This is not connected to what's happening further up in the dike. It's only relevant or related mostly to what's happening here, where there's existing open drain that may be contributing sediment, particularly during storm events, where there is maybe flush of the material into the river. However, these don't translate into increased sediment loads into the main river. So there's again this kind of dilution effect that is happening. So the reds are kind of all the way along the river here. There's no red sites at the mouth of the river here, but this is something again that needs to be kind of considered further, because even small increases in sediment could smother the reds. So the timing of these peaks might be important to consider in the future, and this is something that we're hoping to do a bit further work on. But what was notable, really, as part of Liam's project, and that really this is nothing really to do with the restoration, but more to do with climate change, is that during the time that he did this measurement, most of the points on the dike reached temperature that were close to stress level that could cause stress level to salmon, including one that could cause, that was above the threshold for thermal stress. So we know that from what is available in terms of data, if the temperature in the river is exceeding 23 degrees Celsius, it's likely that it will cause thermal stress to salmon. And so having most of these rivers, and the smaller rivers and the bigger rivers, really getting quite close to or exceeding these thresholds is quite concerning. And so this is where maybe the combination of other nature-based solutions, so potentially riparian planting to create shade, or identification of thermal refugia, that may be places where cold water is coming in or seeping in, would be really important, and maybe the next step of the research that can be done in this and other rivers in the area. So that was the forest to bog restoration kind of part of the story, but there is a lot of other restoration that is taking place quite actively across many of the catchments around the rivers in the flow country. And this is not related to forestry, it's just a historical drain. So unlike Unlike the previous presentation, we're not talking about widening drains, but rather blocking them, very much kind of stopping the flow of the water. And we're fortunate in the flow country that we have one of the estates where pretty much all of the drains have been blocked. So this is the Langwell and Braemore estate in Caithness. And what happened in this estate here, so this is the estate, and there was quite a lot, over nearly 1,000 hectares of historical drains. So you can see the different shades that represent different peatland action projects. So the restoration started in this area and then moved over to this area and then completed here. And this was the final area to be restored. But pretty much all of the catchment has now been restored. There's only a few areas that were unrestorable, so the drains are still open. And what we were interested in here was looking at what does that mean in terms of water quality. And to do that, what Liam did was he sampled every stream at the intersection between the stream and the river itself for a period of 2 years again. And the data that was collected was again monthly, but also targeting storms specifically. And it was a combination of taking the samples and taking them back to the lab to do the nutrients, metal, dissolved organic carbon, color, etc., and in situ, so pH, temperature, and that kind of data sets as well. And really the question that we were asking here was, what happens when you restore an entire catchment to the water quality, and can you disentangle some of the effects of timing of restoration and maybe legacy of drainage in the individual stream, and tie that into what's happening in the bigger river. The Langwell River is one of the salmon SAC, so it was particularly important for the landowner to understand whether the restoration had any potential unintended detrimental impact to the water quality. So when we looked at the time series of data, what was apparent really is that even in the near natural, so undrained, so the yellow color here, the undrained sites that have no drainage, no historical drainage, is that there is a seasonal variation kind of happening. So the water quality changes as the season changes. And what we found really was that all of the different streams and the different, so these are the different ages of restoration. So this is the oldest restoration, is Carbon Flat, followed by the Wag, followed by the Strathy, followed by Salvage, and then the drained one is the areas where there's not been any kind of restoration. And what we can tease out of that really is that the areas that were restored more recently or not restored simply have this kind of amplification of these seasonal patterns. So in the summer, when there's reduction in water volumes, there's a concentration effect, and this concentration effect seems to be more dominant or more prevalent in areas that have either not been restored or that have been restored more recently. So there's this kind of drainage intensity, if you like, effect. And again, you know, we may be fortunate that we work on rivers where the water quality is high enough to have an SAC for salmon. But what we found was none of these changes, even with the drain sites, were pushing those variables above thresholds that would be harmful to salmon. And so really the water quality is already high. There's not much change caused by restoration, and certainly no harmful effects coming on from the heavy machinery going on to the peatlands and doing and filling the drains and reprofiling some of the sites as well. What we see is that, in fact, the changes are much more strongly associated with the precipitation, and the intensity of this summer peak in 2021 was particularly nice to be able to capture because it corresponded to one of the kind of really dry periods, or a seasonal drought that we had in 2021. And even during a drought, none of the water quality parameters went above these harmful thresholds. And we have anecdotal evidence from gauge measurements that were done by the landowners that, in fact, the restoration is probably being helpful in maintaining a base flow during that period of very dry weather. So to sum up this kind of big data set that shows very little in terms of, you know, statistical differences or effect, really, is that the water quality remained high, so there is no evidence that we could find of harmful or potentially unintended consequences of restoration that could be detrimental to salmon. And in fact, we had, on the other hand, anecdotal evidence that the base flow is maintained for longer during the drought period, and that this could be beneficial for salmon, especially if it maintains water flow during critical period for the smolt and the par, the small salmon. So the next bit of that project, so we've looked at one river where there's been an intensive restoration, and we've looked at an entire catchment where there's been restoration. And the next question was, can we go one level up and look at the entire kind of network of rivers that are monitored actively by the Flow Country Rivers Trust that manages the data and looks after the rivers in the Flow Country, and in particular connect that to the salmon habitat and the salmon population themselves. And so in the final bit of his PhD, what Liam did was that we used a historical data set that had been collected by the salmon, the Flow Country Rivers Trust, and they have a kind of a program of electrofishing, so they can collect data on the smolts, the par, so the young salmon, and the fry that come in the rivers. And they have this amazing data sets where they've collected 11 years of electrofishing data, always going back to the same sites with the same protocols at the same time of year. So it's a very robust data set. And what Liam was interested in understanding was looking at density-dependent effects. So basically, how following cohorts over time. So as the salmon get bigger, so they stay for many years in the river. So can we follow the cohorts and see if the 1 year the fry turn into par, turn into par 2+. So how does that kind of follow through? And also looking at density independent effects. So what is happening in the catchment in relation to what is happening in the river. And without going into too much detail, because all of this hopefully will be published quite soon, and there's much, there's a lot of data and things to go through. But really what we found was that it's really difficult to disentangle these two, the dependent and the codependent effect. But we really found mostly that all the rivers behaved slightly differently, and that the behavior could be sometimes tied to the density dependent effect, but also often tied to density independent effect. And one of the strongest or the easiest way to understand that is to look at what happened after the 2018 drought. That would be a very strong indicator of density independent effect. So a climatic event that happened, that was the 2018 drought and the 2021 drought. And then we can see what happened in the rivers in terms of the salmon biomass in relation to these particular events, and then relate that back to the catchment properties of those rivers. So I've just pulled out 4 examples. So the Wick River is a highly modified catchment. So there's some peatland, but a lot of it has been modified with agricultural conversion. There's really intensive agriculture for Caithness anyway, near the catchment, near the river, and it's a bit shorter river, but this is at the top of the catchment. There's a lot of agricultural conversion. The Force is another river that most of the upper parts, which are kind of leading to the point where the electrofishing is done, are in the peatlands. There is not that much modification, but there is a loch at the top here, Loch Shurry, where there's a dam. And the Thurso is mostly intact, and the Landwell, as I've just shown, is intact and restored catchment. And what we can see immediately is that something happened in terms of the biomass in 2018. So there was a crash in the biomass. So the different color represent the different age classes of the fish, but the total biomass basically crashes in 2018. And it crashes further in 2021, where there's another drought. And that's happened in the Wick. We can see that this did not happen in the Thurso, where the catchment is near intact. So there's changes, but not a massive crash happening. It's in fact very similar to population or biomass levels before. And again, a small decrease into 2021, but it picks up again in 2023. So very different kind of responses of the salmon population between 2 very different catchment types. And then we could see what happens here in 2018. There's a crash as well in Force, and then not so much of a crash in 2021. And what we know is that although there might have been a crash, it's not been directly caused by the drought itself, but it's been caused by a failure of the dam to release water, and there was a long, prolonged period of low flow in 2018 that coincided with the drought. And that's why the 2021 drought, where the dam worked properly and released the water at the right time, didn't translate into a similar crash that would happen in the Wick. And in the Langwell, as I've just mentioned with the catchment work that Liam has done, there's actually no crash whatsoever in 2018. In fact, it's a high population, and the purple color just mean in that year the two different age classes of the power could not be differentiated, and then again a small decrease in 2021, but it rebounds really quickly in 2022. So it's very difficult to disentangle all of this, but the key take-home message that we kind of got out of all the data sets and the other rivers that were integrated into this analysis is really that the salmon population in the rivers where the catchments are more modified are more likely to be negatively impacted by climate extremes like storms and droughts. So they're much more likely to be impacted by density independent effects. So things like climate event or further changes in the catchment might just add pressure to these already kind of stressed system. Whereas peatland restoration in the Langwell, for example, and in other, in the other rivers where there's been restoration, appears to mitigate some of these effects. And it may be that other nature-based solutions like riparian planting, planting is missing, are also needed for integrated catchment management, particularly in relation to the temperature that might add stress to these rivers. But I think ultimately what this project really came up with, and particularly the kind of comparison at the end with the rivers, and we've had lots of discussions at the Flow Country Rivers Trust Board meeting around this, is that this kind of crisis in terms of the salmon population, but also more generally about the biodiversity of certain species that use the peatland or use the rivers, but also use the sea or feed on the shores, becomes a bit of a wicked problem to sort out. It means this is multifaceted. This is really difficult to untangle, and there are compounding effects that might be difficult to disentangle with catchment changes like peatland restoration. And in particular for the salmon, what we're seeing, even in the rivers up in the flow country, is increased prevalence of saprolegnia, which is a disease, a fungal disease that really can kill off population of salmon really quickly. And it could be tied to catchment change, but it could also be tied to increased pressure at sea. So if the fish coming back from sea are already stressed, maybe they're more susceptible to these other factors, changes in temperature. So all of these things are really difficult to untangle. And I think that understanding those multiple stressors is really, really important. So understanding that we might need quite a lot of evidence to be able to start to separate some of the effects from the nature-based solution, implemented the solution for biodiversity, but they might be set against a backdrop of already declining biodiversity, of other pressures and other stressors. And really one of the only way that we can start disentangling that is to have really robust long-term data sets that can have baseline that we can then much more robustly disentangle all of these effects. And just wanted to thank you for your attention. I hope this was informative. And if you have any questions, although I'm happy to answer these questions, I'd really encourage you to reach out to Liam, who did most of the groundwork for this. And yeah, hopefully can have a bit more of a discussion now. Thank you.